The golden light of three suns painted the massive space station in brilliant colors as ships from across the galaxy gathered for the most important ceremony in 1,000 years. Harmony's Rest had been built specifically for this moment, constructed in neutral space where neither the Altarian Empire nor the Vegan Confederation could claim ownership. Today, after centuries of bloodshed that had consumed entire star systems, the two greatest powers in the galaxy would finally sign a peace treaty. Ambassador Rix adjusted his ceremonial robes and looked out at the assembled fleet. Altarian warships hung in space like silver daggers, their hulls still bearing scars from recent battles. Across from them, the organic curves of vegan bioships pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that spoke of barely contained aggression. Between them floated the smaller vessels of the Galactic Council, mediators who had worked for decades to bring this moment to reality. The ambassador's aide approached with careful steps. "Sir, both delegations have confirmed their readiness. The signing ceremony can begin whenever you give the order." Rix nodded slowly. He had spent half his life working toward this peace. The 1,000-year war had begun before his grandfather was born, and it had shaped every aspect of galactic civilization. Entire generations had known nothing but conflict, fear, and the constant threat of annihilation. Trade routes had been abandoned, colonies evacuated, and scientific progress had stopped as both empires poured all their resources into military advancement. The main chamber of Harmony's Rest filled with representatives from dozens of worlds. Altarian delegates wore their traditional blue uniforms, medals gleaming on their chests. Their leader, General Corvin, was a veteran of over 200 battles. His face bore the ritual scars that marked him as one of the elite warrior class, and his eyes held the weight of all the soldiers he had commanded and lost. On the opposite side of the chamber, the Vegan delegation presented a stark contrast. Their representative biocontroller Thane had modified his body extensively for space travel. His skin had a slight green tint that allowed him to process certain types of radiation, and his eyes had been altered to see across multiple spectrums. The Vegans believed that adaptation was the key to survival, and their biotechnology reflected this philosophy in every aspect of their society. The ceremony began with traditional prayers from both cultures. The Altarians honored their war dead with a moment of silence, while the Vegans sang a harmony that spoke of growth and renewal. Ambassador Rix felt the tension in the chamber like a physical presence. These two peoples had fought for so long that many wondered if peace was even possible. General Corvin stepped forward first. His voice carried across the chamber without amplification, trained from years of battlefield command. "The Altarian Empire acknowledges that continued warfare serves no purpose. Our worlds are damaged, our fleets reduced, and our people weary of conflict. We agree to these terms in the hope that future generations will know prosperity instead of war." Biocontroller. Thane's response came in the form of harmonic vibrations that the chamber's translation system converted to words. The Vegan Confederation accepts that survival requires adaptation, and adaptation sometimes means choosing peace over conquest. We commit to these agreements and to the healing of our wounded galaxy. The treaty itself was a masterpiece of diplomatic language. It established clear boundaries between Altarian and Vegan space, created trade regulations that would benefit both civilizations, and outlined procedures for resolving future disputes. Most importantly, it included mutual non-aggression clauses that would make another war extremely difficult to justify or finance. As the two leaders signed the document, Ambassador Rix felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The chamber erupted in cheers from the assembled delegates. Ships in the surrounding fleet began broadcasting celebration signals, filling the space around Harmony's Rest with lights and sounds that could be seen from nearby star systems. The signing ceremony concluded with both delegations sharing a meal prepared from foods native to their homeworlds. It was a small gesture but symbolically powerful. For the first time in centuries, Altarians and Vegans sat at the same table without weapons or threats. But even as the celebration continued, Rix knew that the real work was just beginning. Peace. Treaties were easy to sign but difficult to maintain. Both civilizations would need to rebuild not just their damaged worlds, but their entire way of thinking. Generations of soldiers would need to become farmers, engineers, and teachers. Weapons. Factories would need to be converted to produce consumer goods. Most challenging of all, both peoples would need to learn to trust their former enemies. The aftermath of the signing brought immediate changes to galactic civilization. Trade routes that had been abandoned for centuries reopened almost overnight. Refugee camps that had housed displaced populations for decades began to empty as people returned to their homeworlds. Scientific research stations that had been converted to military bases slowly returned to their original purposes. The Altarian Empire began the massive task of demobilizing its war machine. Millions of soldiers were offered training programs to help them transition to civilian life. Shipyards that had produced destroyers and battleships started building cargo vessels and passenger liners. The rigid military hierarchy that had governed Altarian society for generations began to give way to civilian leadership. The Vegan Confederation faced different but equally challenging transitions. Their biotechnology had been focused entirely on warfare for so long that many of their innovations had no peaceful applications. Entire ecosystems that had been engineered to support military operations needed to be redesigned. The collective consciousness that had made their military so effective in battle now had to learn how to think about construction instead of destruction. Meanwhile, in a distant spiral arm of the galaxy, far from the celebration at Harmony's Rest, a small blue planet continued its quiet orbit around a yellow star. The inhabitants of this world had recently achieved something their ancestors had dreamed of for millennia. They had learned to travel faster than light. The first human faster-than-light vessel was small and crude compared to the massive warships that had just signed peace treaties. It carried only a dozen crew members and enough supplies for a 6-month journey. But for the humans aboard, it represented the beginning of their greatest adventure. They were about to discover that their galaxy was much larger and more complex than they had ever imagined. As Ambassador Rix watched the celebration continue around him, he felt satisfied that his life's work had finally borne fruit. The galaxy was at peace, and it would remain so for generations to come. He had no way of knowing that in just a few months, everything would change when a species no one had ever heard of would make contact with the civilized galaxy. The war was done, and the Golden Age was about to begin. Deep space was supposed to be empty, but the sensors on the human vessel Pioneer were detecting something that definitely should not have been there. Chief Navigator Mills double-checked her readings for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, but the massive object ahead of them remained stubbornly real. It was easily 10 times the size of their ship and shaped like nothing in any human engineering textbook. Captain Reed moved away from his command chair to study the display screen more closely. 6 months ago, humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel, and this was only their 4th deep space mission. They had expected to find empty systems, maybe some interesting planets to catalog, but certainly not this. The object was clearly artificial, clearly advanced, and clearly not human. "All stop," Reed ordered quietly. The Pioneer's engines fell silent, leaving them drifting in space only a few thousand kilometers from what could only be an alien spacecraft. "Communications, start broadcasting our standard greeting on all frequencies. Science team, I want every sensor we have focused on that ship. Weapons, keep everything powered down but ready." The alien vessel was beautiful in its own strange way. Its hull appeared to be made of some kind of silver metal that reflected the light of nearby stars in patterns that almost seemed intentional. It had no obvious engines, no visible weapons, and no markings that human eyes could interpret as writing or symbols. But it was clearly sophisticated technology, more advanced than anything humanity had yet achieved. Lieutenant Grant at the communications station looked up from his console with excitement and worry written across his face. "Captain, they're responding to our greeting. The signal is coming through clearly, but the language is completely unknown. The computer is trying to work out some kind of translation matrix." Before Reed could respond, the alien ship began moving toward them. It approached slowly, almost carefully, but the Pioneer sensors showed that it could probably destroy them without much effort. Reed felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. "Maintain position. Keep broadcasting. our peaceful intentions, and somebody get me a translation program that actually works. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Walsh, the mission's xenolinguist, had been studying the alien transmissions for less than an hour when she suddenly started shouting from the science station. "Captain, I think I've got something. They're using mathematical progressions to establish basic concepts. Look at this pattern." The main screen filled with numbers and symbols. To most of the crew it looked like random data, but Dr. Walsh saw something else entirely. They're counting, then showing us geometric shapes, then basic physics constants. It's a universal communication protocol. Any species that has achieved spaceflight should be able to understand it. Over the next several hours, the two ships engaged in the most important conversation in human history. The process was slow and often frustrating, but gradually a basic vocabulary emerged. The aliens called themselves Altarians, and they were part of something called the Galactic Council. They seemed curious about humanity, but also wary. Captain Reed learned that the Altarians were conducting routine patrols along what they considered their territorial boundary. The Pioneer had unknowingly entered space that was claimed by a vast, interstellar civilization. More importantly, the Altarians seemed to think that humanity must be part of some larger organization or alliance. The confusion deepened when the Altarians asked about human territorial claims, military strength, and political alliances. Reed found himself trying to explain that Earth was humanity's only world, that their fleet consisted of exactly 4 ships, and that they had no idea there were other intelligent species in the galaxy. This information caused considerable discussion aboard the Altarian vessel. Reed could hear multiple voices in the background of their transmissions, and the translation suggested that the aliens were having trouble believing what they were hearing. The concept of a species that had just achieved faster-than-light travel was apparently unusual in this part of the galaxy. After several more hours of communication, the Altarian commander made a decision. Humanity would be escorted to the nearest Galactic Council station for proper first contact procedures. It was clear that this was not negotiable, but the Altarians assured Reed that no harm would come to his ship or crew. The journey to Council space took 3 days. The Altarian ship stayed close to the Pioneer throughout the trip, and Reed got his first real glimpse of how vast and organized galactic civilization actually was. They passed through multiple star systems, each one showing clear signs of intelligent habitation. Massive space stations orbited planets, cargo ships moved between worlds, and communication networks carried signals across impossible distances. Dr. Walsh spent the entire journey in intensive language study with the Altarian linguist. By the time they reached their destination, she had developed enough vocabulary to conduct basic conversations. What she learned was both fascinating and intimidating. The galaxy was dominated by 2 major powers, the Altarian Empire and the Vegan Confederation. They had been at war for over 1,000 years but had recently signed a peace treaty. The Galactic Council served as a mediating body between these civilizations and represented dozens of smaller species and worlds. Harmony Station was unlike anything humanity had imagined. The massive structure could have held several Earth cities. Inside its rotating sections, ships from dozens of different species docked at its ports, and the variety of designs and technologies was overwhelming. Reed felt like a primitive ancestor suddenly transported to a modern city. Ambassador Ricks met them personally at the docking bay. The council representative was tall and thin, with features that were almost human but not quite. His skin had a slight blue tint, and his eyes were larger than human normal, but his manner was warm and welcoming. The first contact procedures were surprisingly bureaucratic. Humanity was given a series of forms to fill out, questionnaires about their culture and technology, and medical examinations to ensure compatibility with station life. The whole process took nearly a week. During that time, Reed and his crew learned more about galactic politics than they had ever wanted to know. The recent peace between the Altarians and Vegans was still fragile, and both civilizations were focused on rebuilding after centuries of warfare. Neither seemed particularly interested in humanity beyond basic curiosity. The final step in the first contact process was the assignment of territorial space. Ambassador Rix showed them a three-dimensional map of the local galactic region and pointed to a small area that appeared to be empty space. This sector contains several star systems that are currently unclaimed. The Council is prepared to recognize human sovereignty over this region, provided you agree to our basic treaties and trade agreements. Captain Reed stared at the map in amazement. The space they were being offered was larger than anything humanity had dreamed of exploring. It contained dozens of star systems and potentially hundreds of worlds, but compared to the vast territories controlled by the Altarians and vegans, it was almost insignificant. Dr. Walsh served as humanity's first ambassador to the galactic community. She established a small embassy on Harmony Station and began the long process of integrating humanity into interstellar civilization. The work was challenging, but she found most species willing to help the newcomers learn the complex rules and customs that governed galactic society. The news of first contact reached Earth 6 months after the pioneers' initial encounter. The reaction was everything from celebration to panic, but humanity as a whole seemed ready to take its place among the stars. More ships were built, more exploration missions launched, and plans were made for humanity's first interstellar colonies. But even as humanity celebrated its entry into galactic civilization, very few people paid attention to the detailed reports. The Captain Reed and Dr. Walsh filed with Earth Command. Those reports contained observations about Altarian technology, notes about vegan bioengineering, and careful analysis of the political tensions that still existed beneath the surface of galactic peace. Humanity had been welcomed into the galaxy as a minor species, interesting but not particularly important. The great powers had their own concerns, their own rebuilding to do, and their own complex relationships to manage. Nobody seemed to think that the newcomers would be anything more than another small voice in the council chambers. They would learn how wrong they were soon enough. The repair bay on Vegan Station Delta 7 had been broken for over 6 months, and 3 different engineering teams had failed to fix it. The problem was complex, involving biomechanical interfaces that had evolved over centuries of warfare and were now incompatible with the station's newer peaceful systems. Biocontroller Zenth had almost given up hope when the human trader arrived with an unusual offer. Engineer Torres stepped carefully around the massive organic components that formed the station's living infrastructure. The vegan technology was unlike anything he had studied, but engineering problems were still engineering problems regardless of whether they involved metal or living tissue. He spent 2 hours examining the damaged systems while Zenth watched with growing skepticism. "Your biointerfaces are trying to maintain military protocols," Torres explained through the translation device. "But your newer systems are operating on civilian frequencies. It's like trying to tune 2 radios to different stations and expecting them to play the same music." Zenth's body language shifted in what Torres had learned indicated surprise. The vegan had multiple appendages that could express different emotions simultaneously, and right now, they were showing confusion mixed with curiosity. "No engineering. Team has identified this problem. How did you determine the cause so quickly?" Torres shrugged in the universal human gesture that somehow translated across species barriers. "Fresh eyes, maybe. Sometimes when you're too close to a problem, you can't see the simple solution. Mind if I try something?" What followed was 3 hours of careful work that combined human innovation with vegan biotechnology. Torres couldn't directly interface with the living components, but he could modify the mechanical systems to communicate more effectively with them. By the end of the day, the repair bay was functioning better than it had in years. Word of Torres' success spread quickly through both Altarian and vegan space. Within weeks, human engineers were being requested at facilities throughout the galaxy. They brought with them a different way of thinking about problems, one that wasn't limited by centuries of traditional approaches or military thinking. Dr. Kim faced a different kind of challenge on the Altarian Medical Research Station Epsilon Prime. The station's chief physician, Medical Commander Rex, had been struggling with a disease that affected multiple species throughout the galaxy. Traditional Altarian medicine focused on treating symptoms, while vegan biotechnology attempted to adapt the patient's body to resist the disease. Neither approach had been successful. Kim spent her first week at the station simply observing and asking questions. She studied case files, interviewed patients, and analyzed tissue samples using both human and alien techniques. The other medical staff were polite, but clearly skeptical about what a newcomer from a primitive species could contribute to their research. The breakthrough came when Kim realized that everyone had been thinking about the disease wrong. Instead of trying to fight it or adapt to it, she proposed working with it. "What if this isn't really a disease?" she asked during a staff meeting. "What if it's actually a symbiotic organism that has lost its balance?" The idea was radical by galactic standards, but Kim's research supported her theory. The organism causing the illness had characteristics of both a parasite and a beneficial bacteria. In some patients, it actually seemed to provide advantages like enhanced immune system function and improved healing rates. Working with both Altarian and vegan medical teams, Kim developed a treatment that didn't destroy the organism, but helped it find its proper balance within the host body. The results were dramatic. Patients who had been suffering for years recovered completely, and many reported feeling healthier than they had before the initial infection. The success made Kim the most famous human in galactic medical circles, but more importantly, it demonstrated that human approaches to problem-solving could complement existing alien knowledge. Medical centers throughout the galaxy began requesting human consultants and researchers. Meanwhile, economist Brown was revolutionizing galactic trade from his small office on Harmony Station. The existing trade agreements between Altarian and vegan space were complex, bureaucratic, and inefficient, and they had been designed during wartime to prevent either side from gaining too much advantage, but they were poorly suited to peacetime commerce. Brown studied the trade patterns for months before proposing a radical simplification. Instead of the hundreds of regulations and restrictions that currently governed interspecies commerce, he suggested a basic framework based on mutual benefit and competitive advantage. Each species would focus on producing what they did best, then trade freely with others. The proposal was initially rejected by both Altarian and vegan trade authorities. They argued that such a system was too simple to work in practice and would inevitably lead to exploitation. But Brown had done his homework. He presented detailed economic models showing how his approach would increase prosperity for everyone involved. The first pilot program was implemented in a small sector containing both human and mixed species colonies. Within 6 months, trade volume had increased by over 400%, and all participating worlds reported significant economic growth. The success was impossible to ignore, and gradually Brown's principles were adopted throughout the galaxy. What made these human successes particularly remarkable was that they happened without any central coordination or planning. Torres, Kim, and Brown were working independently, pursuing their own interests and specialties. But their combined impact was transforming galactic civilization in ways that neither the Altarians nor vegans had anticipated. General Lane spent his time more quietly but no less effectively. Officially, he was humanity's military liaison to the Galactic Council, responsible for ensuring that human colonies met their defense obligations. Unofficially, he was conducting the most comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation in galactic history. Lane visited Altarian military bases under the guise of learning their defense protocols. He toured vegan bioweapon facilities as part of arms control inspections. He attended strategy meetings, participated in joint training exercises, and built relationships with officers from both civilizations. Everyone assumed he was just another minor species representative trying to understand how galactic defense really worked. What they didn't realize was that Lane was mapping their entire military infrastructure. He identified command structures, supply lines, communication networks, and strategic weaknesses. His training as a human military officer had taught him to think in ways that the aliens, shaped by centuries of traditional warfare, simply didn't. Consider, the Altarians were powerful but predictable. Their military operated according to established doctrines that had been refined over generations. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and extremely effective within their traditional parameters. But they had trouble adapting to unexpected situations or unconventional tactics. The Vegans were more flexible, but less coordinated. Their biotechnology gave them significant advantages in certain types of combat. But their decentralized command structure made large-scale operations difficult. They were excellent at defensive warfare but struggled with coordinated offensive campaigns. More importantly, Lane realized that both civilizations had become comfortable with their new peace. Their military forces were focused on rebuilding and peacekeeping rather than warfare. Their officer corps was increasingly dominated by administrators rather than combat veterans. They had begun to lose the edge that had made them effective. During the long war, Lane kept his observations to himself, filing encrypted reports that only a few people on Earth were authorized to read. But he continued his work, visiting more bases, meeting more officers, and learning more about how galactic military power really functioned. By the end of the first year after human contact, the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Humans had an unusual ability to see solutions that escaped more advanced civilizations. They could work effectively with any species, adapt quickly to new situations, and think outside the established frameworks that had governed galactic society for centuries. Most aliens attributed this to humanity's primitive status. They assumed that humans succeeded because they didn't know enough to realize that certain problems were supposed to be difficult. The attitude was condescending, but not hostile. Humans were seen as clever children who might someday grow up to become real contributors to galactic civilization. But a few observers, particularly Ambassador Rix, began to suspect that something more significant was happening. The human successes weren't random or accidental. They followed patterns that suggested systematic capabilities rather than lucky accidents. Humans seemed to possess some fundamental advantage that more advanced species had somehow lost. The question was whether this advantage represented opportunity or threat. So far, humans had used their abilities to benefit everyone, solving problems and creating prosperity wherever they went. But Rix remembered enough history to know that the most successful species weren't always the most benevolent ones. He decided to keep watching and learning, just in case humanity turned out to be something more than the friendly newcomers they appeared to be. The mining asteroid designated as Kepler 7743 had been nothing more than a number on a chart until two survey teams arrived there on the same day. The Altarian crew had been following their assigned patrol route when they detected massive deposits of rare metals essential for faster-than-light engine construction. 3 hours later, a Vegan bioprospecting vessel emerged from hyperspace with the same target in mind. Commander Vale of the Altarian survey ship Steadfast watched through his view screen as the organic curves of the vegan vessel approached the asteroid. According to the peace treaty signed just 18 months earlier, this region of space was supposed to be a neutral mining zone, where both civilizations could extract resources according to carefully negotiated quotas. The problem was that both sides had different interpretations of those quotas. "Sir," Lieutenant Davis reported from the communications station, "the Vegan ship is claiming exclusive extraction rights based on biological survey priority. They say their bioscanners detected the mineral deposits first, which gives them precedence under Section 7 Alpha of the Mining Accords." Vale studied the treaty documentation on his screen. The language was complex, written by diplomats trying to prevent exactly this kind of situation. But legal complexity often created more problems than it solved. "What's our claim based on?" "Territorial proximity, sir. We were conducting scheduled patrols in this sector under the border security provisions. Article 12 states that patrol vessels have first mining rights within their assigned areas. Both claims were technically valid under different interpretations of the treaty. The Altarians could argue that their patrol gave them territorial authority, while the Vegans could claim that their bioscanning technology had established prior discovery rights. It was exactly the kind of legal ambiguity that had caused problems during the war years. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next several hours. Neither side was willing to back down, and both vessels began sending detailed reports back to their respective governments. What had started as a simple mining dispute quickly became a test of the entire peace treaty. On Harmony Station, Ambassador Rix received emergency notifications from both sides almost simultaneously. The Altarian report accused the Vegans of aggressive territorial expansion, disguised as resource extraction. The Vegan report claimed that Altarian military vessels were intimidating civilian bioprospectors in neutral space. Rix felt a familiar cold sensation in his stomach as he read the reports. This was how wars started, with small incidents that escalated beyond anyone's ability to control them. He immediately opened communication channels with both vessels and began the delicate work of mediation. But mediation required trust, and trust was exactly what the peace treaty had failed to establish. Both civilizations were still suspicious of each other, still ready to interpret any action as a potential threat. The 1,000-year war had left psychological scars that legal documents couldn't heal. Within 24 hours, both the Altarian Empire and the Vegan Confederation had dispatched military fleets to the disputed asteroid. What had begun as a mining survey had become an armed standoff involving dozens of warships from both sides. Admiral Stone received the intelligence reports at the Human Military Coordination Center on Luna. The facility had been built during the past year as humanity expanded its role in galactic affairs, but it had never been intended to monitor potential interstellar conflicts. Stone studied the tactical displays with growing concern. "How many ships are we talking about?" he asked his intelligence officer, Major Rivers. 47 Altarian vessels including 6 heavy battleships. The Vegan fleet numbers 52 ships, mostly biocruisers with extensive weapons modification. Both fleets are maintaining defensive positions, but they're within weapons range of each other. Stone had spent the past year studying both civilizations, officially as part of humanity's integration into galactic defense planning. Unofficially, he had been preparing for exactly this kind of situation. "What's the current diplomatic status?" "Ambassador, Rix is trying to mediate, but neither side trusts the other. The Altarians think this is vegan expansionism testing the peace treaty. The Vegans believe the Altarians are using military intimidation to steal resources. Both sides are demanding that humanity choose sides." That was the crucial point. Humanity had carefully maintained neutrality in galactic affairs, building relationships with both civilizations while avoiding any appearance of favoritism. But neutrality became impossible when conflicts escalated to the point where everyone had to choose sides. Dr. Walsh, now serving as Earth's senior diplomatic representative, had been working frantically to prevent exactly this scenario. Her staff had identified several potential flashpoints where the peace treaty's ambiguous language could cause problems. But identifying problems and solving them were two different things. "Both sides are demanding support," she reported to the emergency session of Earth's Governing Council. "The Altarians want us to acknowledge their territorial claims. The Vegans want us to condemn military intimidation of civilian vessels. If we support either side, we automatically become enemies of the other." The human response was carefully crafted to avoid taking sides while still attempting to de-escalate the situation. Dr. Walsh issued a statement calling for peaceful resolution and offering human mediation services. It was a diplomatic non-answer that satisfied nobody and probably made the situation worse. Meanwhile, human agents throughout both civilizations were reporting increasingly disturbing intelligence. The mining dispute had awakened old prejudices and fears that the peace treaty had suppressed rather than resolved. Politicians in both governments were facing pressure from military factions that had never really accepted the end of the war. Captain Torres, now working on infrastructure projects throughout the galaxy, found himself caught in the middle of rapidly changing attitudes. Altarian engineers who had welcomed his assistance just weeks earlier were suddenly cold and suspicious. Vegan biotechnicians began questioning whether humans could be trusted with sensitive technology. The worst part was that Torres began discovering evidence of sabotage at several facilities where he had worked. Critical systems that had been functioning perfectly were mysteriously failing, often in ways that created safety hazards or economic losses. Someone was deliberately trying to undermine human contributions to galactic society. Dr. Kim faced similar problems in the medical community. Her breakthrough treatment for the multi-species disease had been widely adopted, but now some medical facilities were reporting treatment failures and side effects that hadn't appeared in any previous trials. When she investigated, she found that the treatment protocols had been subtly modified in ways that guaranteed failure. The pattern was clear to anyone looking at the full picture. Extremist factions within both civilizations were working to undermine the peace by creating crises that would force a return to warfare. The mining dispute hadn't been an accident. It had been carefully orchestrated by groups that had never accepted the end of the Thousand-Year War. But proving this conspiracy required intelligence capabilities that officially didn't exist. General Lane's network of contacts and observers had uncovered evidence of coordination between Altarian military hardliners and vegan biosupremacist movements. Both groups were working together to destroy the peace they saw as weakness and betrayal. The evidence was solid but politically impossible to present. Revealing how much intelligence humanity had gathered would expose the fact that they had been systematically studying both civilizations far more thoroughly than anyone realized. It would also raise questions about human capabilities and intentions that could not be answered without revealing the true extent of their military preparations. As the crisis deepened, more fleets arrived at the disputed asteroid. The Altarians sent reinforcements claiming the need to protect their territorial integrity. The Vegans responded with bioweapon platforms designed to counter traditional military vessels. Within a week, the largest concentration of military power since the end of the Thousand-Year War was facing off over a piece of rock that neither side particularly needed. Ambassador Rix made one final attempt at mediation, proposing a joint mining operation with shared profits and rotating administrative control. Both sides rejected the proposal as unacceptable compromise with enemies who couldn't be trusted. On Earth, emergency sessions of the human government continued around the clock. Military advisors presented increasingly grim assessments of what would happen if the Galactic War resumed. Trade would collapse, colonies would be evacuated, and humanity's brief golden age of expansion would end before it had really begun. The final trigger came from an unexpected source. A vegan bioprobe, conducting routine scans of the asteroid's composition, detected what appeared to be Altarian military sensor equipment hidden within the rock structure. The vegans immediately accused the Altarians of using the mining dispute as cover for intelligence-gathering operations. The Altarians denied the charges but couldn't explain how their technology had gotten into the asteroid. Later analysis would show that the sensor equipment had been planted by extremist groups, but by then it was too late. The vegan fleet commander, convinced that he was facing a military deception operation, ordered his forces to battle readiness. Within hours, the first shots were fired. They began as warning salvos, meant to demonstrate resolve rather than cause damage. But warning shots between hostile fleets had a way of escalating beyond anyone's control. A vegan biomissile, intended to disable an Altarian sensor array, instead struck the ship's life support systems. 17 Altarian crew members died in the resulting explosion. The retaliation was immediate and overwhelming. Altarian battleships opened fire with weapons that had been designed during centuries of warfare. The lead vegan vessel was destroyed before its crew could even attempt to surrender. Within minutes, the largest space battle in over a year was raging around asteroid Kepler 7743. News of the battle reached both capitals within hours. Emergency sessions of both governments resulted in full military mobilization for the first time since the peace treaty was signed. The Thousand-Year War was about to resume, and this time it might not end until one civilization had completely destroyed the other. But as the fleets prepared for renewed warfare, a few people in scattered locations began implementing plans that had been months in the making. Admiral Stone received final authorization for Operation Clear Sky. General Lane activated intelligence, networks that had been dormant since their establishment. Dr. Walsh sent coded messages to human agents throughout both civilizations. The war was beginning again, but humanity was no longer the helpless newcomer that had stumbled into galactic civilization 18 months earlier. They had learned, prepared, and positioned themselves for this moment. The galaxy was about to discover that the primitive species from the small blue planet had become something much more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The first day of the renewed galactic war brought destruction on a scale that dwarfed even the worst battles of the previous conflict. 17 star systems became battlegrounds. As both civilizations unleashed military technologies they had continued developing during the supposed peace. Billions of civilians fled their homes as entire planets were evacuated in anticipation of orbital bombardments. Admiral Stone stood in the command center deep beneath Luna's surface, watching real-time intelligence reports stream in from across the galaxy. The facility had been constructed over the past 18 months, officially as humanity's contribution to galactic defense coordination. In reality, it was the nerve center of the most sophisticated military operation in the galaxy's recorded history. Status report. Stone requested quietly. Major Rivers consulted her displays, which showed information that no other species in the galaxy possessed. Altarian battle fleets have engaged Vegan forces in 7 systems. Current casualty estimates indicate over 50,000 military deaths in the first 12 hours. Both sides are committing their reserve fleets. Sir, they're not holding anything. Back this time. Stone nodded grimly. The intelligence reports had predicted this level of escalation, but seeing it happen in real time was still sobering. Communication status with our field assets. All networks operational. General Lane reports that both military commands are operating according to predicted doctrine. Dr. Walsh confirms that diplomatic channels have completely broken down. Engineer Torres and his teams are standing by at designated infrastructure points. The plan that humanity had been developing for over a year was elegant in its simplicity. While the galaxy's 2 superpowers had been focused on rebuilding and maintaining their fragile peace, humanity had been quietly studying, learning, and preparing for the inevitable moment when that peace would fail. Every human who had worked within Altarian or vegan systems had been gathering intelligence. Every friendship built, every collaboration established, every act of assistance provided had also been an opportunity to understand how galactic civilization really functioned. The aliens had seen helpful newcomers eager to contribute. They had never suspected that they were hosting the most comprehensive intelligence operation in galactic history. The breakthrough had come when General Lane realized that both civilizations shared the same fundamental weakness. They thought in terms of traditional warfare, fleet battles, territorial control, and industrial capacity. Their entire military doctrine was based on centuries of experience fighting each other using conventional tactics and strategies. But humanity had studied asymmetric warfare, unconventional tactics, and system-level vulnerabilities that the aliens had never seriously considered. While Altarian and vegan commanders were planning to resume their traditional patterns of attack and defense, humanity was preparing to rewrite the rules of galactic warfare entirely. Initiate Phase 1, Stone ordered. Across 17 star systems, human agents who had spent months embedded within both civilizations began their work. They weren't soldiers in any traditional sense. Most were engineers, doctors, economists, and technicians who had earned the trust and friendship of their alien colleagues, but they had also been trained for this moment. Engineer Torres was working in the primary power distribution facility on Altarian Command Station Delta Prime when he received the coded signal. The facility supplied energy to the entire military command network for 3-star systems. Torres had been helping to upgrade its efficiency for the past 6 months, and in the process had learned exactly how to shut it down. The process took less than 10 minutes. Torres introduced carefully designed feedback loops into the power grid that caused a cascade failure throughout the entire network. To anyone investigating later, it would appear that the station's aging infrastructure had finally succumbed to the stress of wartime power demands. Similar incidents occurred simultaneously throughout both military networks. Dr. Kim triggered medical emergencies that required immediate attention from senior officers. Economist Brown caused financial system crashes that disrupted military supply lines. Communications specialist Davis introduced signal interference that made coordination between fleets extremely difficult. None of these actions alone would have been decisive, but their cumulative effect was devastating. Within 6 hours of the AIT first attack, both military commands were struggling with communication failures, supply shortages, power outages, and system malfunctions that seemed to be multiplying faster than they could be repaired. The second phase began as both civilizations realized they were facing something much more serious than random technical failures. Human military vessels, which had remained carefully neutral and non-threatening throughout the crisis, suddenly appeared throughout both empires simultaneously. Captain Reed, now commanding the human battle cruiser Defiance, led a squadron that materialized in the heart of Altarian space. The ships were small compared to the massive battleships that both sides had been building, but they moved with precision and purpose that demonstrated capabilities no one had suspected. The Altarian Defense Fleet responded exactly as human intelligence had predicted. They formed traditional battle formations and attempted to engage the human ships using conventional tactics. But the humans had studied Altarian doctrine for over a year, and they knew exactly how to counter every move. The human ships didn't try to match firepower with the larger alien vessels. Instead, they targeted specific systems with surgical precision. Communication arrays, sensor networks, and engine systems were disabled with weapons that seemed designed specifically for the task. Within hours, the Altarian defense fleet found itself blind, deaf, and unable to maneuver effectively. The human ships had achieved total tactical superiority without destroying a single enemy vessel or killing a single crew member. The same pattern was repeated throughout Vegan space, where human biowarfare specialists had developed countermeasures, specifically designed to neutralize Vegan advantages. The organic ships that had been nearly invulnerable during the 1,000-year war suddenly found themselves helpless against human biodisruption technology. But the most devastating phase of the human operation wasn't military at all. It was economic and social. Dr. Walsh activated networks of human agents who had been building relationships throughout both civilizations for over a year. These agents weren't spies in any traditional sense. They were teachers, doctors, engineers, and traders who had genuinely helped improve life for millions of aliens. But they were also in positions to influence public opinion in ways that military action alone never could. The message they delivered was simple and coordinated. The war was not between Altarians and Vegans. It was being orchestrated by extremist factions within both governments who had never accepted the peace treaty. The evidence had been gathered over months of careful investigation, and it was overwhelming. Military leaders who had been advocating for war were shown to have financial connections to weapons manufacturers. Politicians who had been promoting territorial expansion were revealed to have secret agreements with industrial combines that would benefit from renewed conflict. Most damaging of all, the entire mining dispute that had triggered the war was exposed as a deliberate provocation planned by extremist groups from both sides. The revelation of this information caused more damage to both military commands than any battle could have achieved. Soldiers began questioning orders from leaders they no longer trusted. Officers found themselves facing mutiny from crews who refused to fight a war based on lies. Politicians discovered that their own populations were turning against them. Within 72 hours of the first human military action, both the Altarian Empire and the Vegan Confederation were facing complete governmental collapse. Their fleets were disabled. Their command structures were in chaos, and their populations were demanding an immediate end to the war. It was at this moment that Admiral Stone authorized the final phase of the operation. Captain Reed's voice was broadcast simultaneously to every inhabited world in both empires, carried by communication networks that humanity had quietly infiltrated over the past year. "Citizens of the galaxy," Reed began, his words translated instantly into dozens of languages. The war that began 3 days ago was based on lies created by extremist factions who wanted to return your civilizations to centuries of pointless conflict. That war is now over. The broadcast continued for 20 minutes, during which Reed presented evidence of the conspiracy, explained how human agents had prevented the war from spreading, and offered humanity's terms for permanent peace. Those terms were surprisingly generous. Humanity demanded no territory, no tribute, and no submission from either civilization. They asked only for recognition of human authority in maintaining galactic peace and the establishment of new governmental systems that would prevent extremist factions from gaining power in the future. The response from both civilizations was remarkably uniform. Populations that had been preparing for another 1,000 years of warfare suddenly found themselves offered permanent peace under human protection. The choice was obvious to everyone except the military and political leaders who had lost all credibility. Within a week, both the Altarian Empire and the Vegan Confederation had undergone complete governmental restructuring. New leaders, chosen, with human guidance and approval, began implementing political systems designed to prevent the kind of extremism that had nearly destroyed galactic civilization. Ambassador Rix, who had dedicated his life to maintaining peace between the great Powers found himself serving as humanity's liaison to the new galactic government. The irony was not lost on him that the species he had initially dismissed as primitive newcomers had become the dominant force in galactic politics. "How long have you been planning this?" Rix asked during one of his private meetings with Dr. Walsh. Walsh smiled with the expression that humans use to indicate both amusement and satisfaction. "Since our first day in galactic civilization, we studied your history, analyzed your conflicts, and realized that the peace treaty was just a temporary pause in a war that would inevitably resume. Someone had to be prepared to end it permanently." "But why?" Rix asked. "You could have simply avoided the conflict entirely. Your species was never in any real danger." "Because we learned something during our first year among you," Walsh replied. "The galaxy is full of intelligent species, with incredible capabilities, but you've all been trapped in patterns of thinking that prevent you from reaching your potential. The 1,000-Year War wasn't just wasteful. It was preventing the kind of cooperation and innovation that could benefit everyone." The establishment of the Terran hegemony was formalized 6 months later in a ceremony that took place on the same station where the original peace treaty had been signed. But this time, the agreement wasn't between two exhausted enemies. It was between humanity and a galaxy that had finally learned the difference between peace and the absence of war. The new galactic government operated under human oversight, but with representation from all member species. The Altarians and Vegans retained autonomy over their internal affairs, but surrendered authority over military and foreign policy to human administrators who had proven their competence in ways that could not be questioned. Trade flourished as artificial barriers between civilizations were eliminated. Scientific research accelerated as species that had been enemies for centuries began collaborating on projects that had been impossible during the war years. Exploration resumed as military resources were redirected toward peaceful expansion and discovery. But perhaps most importantly, the galaxy learned that true peace wasn't just the absence of conflict, it was the presence of justice, prosperity, and hope for the future. Admiral Stone often reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 18 months earlier, humanity had been a species of primitives who had just achieved faster-than-light travel. Now they were the acknowledged leaders of a galactic civilization that encompassed thousands of worlds and dozens of intelligent species. The transition hadn't been achieved through conquest or domination, but through the simple demonstration that humanity possessed both the capability and the will to prevent the kind of destructive conflicts that had plagued the galaxy for centuries. The war had indeed been done when humanity arrived. They had just needed to prove it to everyone else.